People like to believe that parents love all their children equally. I believed that too, until I was old enough to understand that in our house, love was something you had to earn. My older brother, Ethan, never had to earn it. He was born with it. He was the golden son. I was simply the mistake everyone tolerated. Growing up, the rules were always different for us. If Ethan forgot to do his chores, Mom laughed and called him busy. If I forgot once, I was grounded for a week. When Ethan failed a class in college, Dad blamed the professor. When I graduated at the top of my class, my parents barely looked up from their phones. It isn't a competition, Mom always said whenever I asked why everything seemed so unfair, but it always was. Every birthday proved it. Ethan received expensive vacations, luxury watches, and even a brand new sports car for his 21st birthday. My birthdays were celebrated with grocery, store cupcakes, and speeches about how I should be grateful for having a roof over my head. Eventually, I stopped expecting anything from them. The only person who ever believed in me was my grandmother. Before she passed away, she held my hand and whispered something I never forgot. Never let people decide your worth, Liam. One day, the truth always finds its way into the light. At the time, I thought she was comforting me. Years later, I realized she had been preparing me. After graduating from university, I quietly moved across the country. My parents hardly noticed. In fact, Mom called only once. "You're an adult now," she said. "Don't expect us to rescue you every time life gets difficult." I smiled after hanging up. I had never expected them to rescue me. Over the next 8 years, I built a life entirely on my own. I worked long hours, took risks, and surrounded myself with people who valued honesty more than appearances. While my family assumed I was struggling in some tiny apartment, my life had become something they couldn't even imagine. I never corrected them. Sometimes silence is the greatest disguise. Then one rainy Tuesday evening, my phone rang. "Mom," I almost ignored it. Almost. "Liam." She cried the second I answered. "We've missed you so much." The sudden affection made every alarm bell in my head ring at once. "What happened?" I asked. She hesitated. "Nothing happened. Can't a mother call her son?" "No, not after 8 years. Not after hundreds of unanswered messages I had once sent." Dad's voice suddenly joined the call. "We're having a family dinner this Saturday. Ethan really wants you there." That was the biggest lie of the year. Ethan hadn't spoken to me since our grandmother's funeral. Still, curiosity got the better of me. "I'll think about it. We'd really appreciate it," Mom said sweetly. The call ended. For the next several days, something felt wrong. My instincts, ones I had learned to trust through years of difficult decisions, refused to stay quiet. On Saturday evening, I drove to my childhood home. Nothing had changed. The same white fence, the same dying rose bushes, the same house that had never truly felt like home. Mom greeted me with an unusually warm hug. "Liam, you look wonderful." Dad even smiled. That alone made me suspicious. Dinner was strangely pleasant. Too pleasant. They asked about my health. They complimented my clothes. They laughed at my jokes. Even Ethan acted friendly. I knew my family. This wasn't kindness. It was preparation. Then dessert arrived. Dad cleared his throat. "Ethan has been having a little business trouble." There it was. I stayed silent. Mom reached across the table. "Your brother just needs a little help." "What kind of help?" Ethan avoided my eyes. Dad slid a folder across the table. "Just sign these documents." I opened the folder. The first page made my stomach tighten. It listed me as the financial director of a company I had never worked for. The second page transferred responsibility for millions of dollars in missing funds directly onto my shoulders. I looked up slowly. "What exactly is this?" Mom forced a smile. It's just paperwork. No. Dad's voice hardened. It protects your brother. The room fell silent. You want me to take responsibility for a crime I didn't commit. It's only temporary, Ethan muttered. If investigators ask questions, Dad continued, you'll say you handled the finances. I stared at every face around the table. Not one of them looked ashamed. They had already decided. My freedom was simply the price of protecting their favorite son. I gently closed the folder. I'm not signing. Dad slammed his fist onto the table. You owe this family. No. I answered quietly. I stopped owing this family the day you decided I was expendable. Mom's expression instantly changed from fake kindness to icy anger. You've always been selfish. Ethan finally looked at me. If you don't help me, I'll lose everything. I stood. So be it. As I reached the front door, Dad shouted after me, if you walk away now, don't ever call us family again. Without turning around, I answered, you stopped being my family a long time ago. I stepped outside into the cold night. Behind me, the front door slammed shut. I didn't know it yet, but refusing to sign those papers had just started a war. And before the week was over, my own parents would try to send me to prison for a crime their golden son had committed. 3 days after I walked out of my parents' house, I was making coffee before work when a loud knock echoed through my apartment. It wasn't the kind of knock a neighbor made. It was firm. Official. When I opened the door, 2 police detectives stood in the hallway. Mr. Liam Carter, one of them asked. Yes, we need you to come with us regarding an investigation into financial fraud and embezzlement. For a brief second, I simply stared at them. So they had actually done it. My own parents had gone through with their plan. I assumed someone filed a complaint, I asked calmly. The older detective nodded. Several witnesses have provided statements, and documents list you as the financial director responsible for the missing funds. Exactly the documents they had tried to force me to sign. Only somehow, they now existed with what looked like my signature. Someone had forged it. I quietly followed the officers to the station. Panic would accomplish nothing. Fear was exactly what my family expected from me. Instead, I stayed silent. Inside the interview room, investigators spread dozens of papers across the table. Bank transfers, corporate records, employment contracts, every document pointed directly at me. One detective folded his arms. These records suggest you diverted nearly $8 million over the last 2 years. I looked through each page carefully. The forgery was impressive, very impressive, but not perfect. The signature looked like mine at first glance, yet one tiny detail gave it away. I never wrote my middle initial. The forged signature did. Someone had copied it from an old government document. I didn't sign these. I said. The detective sighed. Everyone says you did. Everyone. He opened another folder. My stomach didn't sink, it hardened. The first statement belonged to my father. The second was my mother's. The third was Ethan's. Each one described me as a jealous younger brother who had secretly controlled the company's finances. They claimed Ethan had trusted me completely. They claimed I had betrayed him. It was a carefully rehearsed story. One lie supporting another. I almost admired the effort. Almost. The detectives exchanged glances. Do you have anyone willing to verify your whereabouts over the last 2 years? I smiled faintly. More people than you realize. Several hours later, I was released on conditional bail while the investigation continued. News travels fast. By the following morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Some messages were sympathetic. Most were not. I can't believe you'd steal from your own brother. You seemed like such a good person. Hope prison is worth it. Old classmates removed me from social media. Business contacts. suddenly stopped replying. Even distant relatives, who hadn't spoken to me in years, somehow found time to condemn me. It was amazing how quickly people accepted a lie when enough voices repeated it. That evening, my parents held a family gathering. Not to support me, to celebrate Ethan's innocence. Photos filled social media, smiling faces, expensive dinner. Captions praising Ethan's strength during such a difficult time, as if he were the victim. One picture caught my attention. Grandmother's silver necklace hung around Mom's neck. She had promised it would someday belong to me. Another promise broken, I closed the app without another thought. Material things no longer mattered. Truth did. The next morning, someone knocked on my office door, not the police. A woman in a navy blue suit entered carrying a leather briefcase. She looked confident enough to own the building. Mr. Carter, yes. She extended her hand. My name is Victoria Hayes. I shook it. I've never heard of you. I know, she smiled, but I've heard a great deal about you. She placed a business card on my desk. The name of one of the country's most prestigious law firms was printed beneath hers. I've been asked to represent you. I didn't hire an attorney, no. She sat down calmly. Someone else did. Who? I'm afraid my client requested complete confidentiality. I studied her face. She wasn't bluffing. Why would a stranger spend this kind of money on me? Victoria leaned forward. Because certain people know exactly who you are. Her words lingered in the room, not who I pretended to be, who I really was. She opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder. Before anyone accused you, someone anticipated this possibility. Inside were copies of surveillance logs, encrypted emails, financial audits, and timestamps dating back several years. Every page had been carefully organized, every detail preserved. Every lie my family intended to tell already had an answer waiting. I looked at her. How long has this been prepared? She smiled knowingly. Long before your parents realized they were playing a game they could never win. For the first time since the accusations began, I allowed myself a small smile. My family believed they had cornered the forgotten son. They believed I would panic, beg for mercy, accept prison to protect their precious Ethan. They had no idea that I had spent years preparing for the day someone tried to destroy everything I had built. As Victoria stood to leave, she handed me a single envelope. Read this the night before court. What's inside? A reminder, she replied, of the person you've worked so hard to become. After she left, I stared at the envelope for several minutes. Outside my office window, dark clouds gathered over the city. The storm my family had created was finally arriving, but they still believed I was powerless. They were about to discover that the forgotten child they tried to sacrifice had become the one person capable of exposing every secret they had spent a lifetime hiding. The morning of preliminary court hearing arrived with gray skies and steady rain, as if the weather itself understood the weight of what was about to happen. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as every new arrival became another headline. Financial fraud involving a respected family had become the city's favorite story, and according to the news, I was already guilty. I stepped out of my car without saying a word. Victoria Hayes walked beside me. Calm as ever, nervous, she asked. I adjusted my tie and smiled faintly. No, good, she replied, because today isn't about proving your innocence. I looked at her. It's about letting them prove their guilt. Inside the courtroom, my parents sat beside Ethan, dressed in expensive suits and wearing carefully rehearsed expressions of heartbreak. To anyone watching, they looked like a family devastated by betrayal. Mom dabbed fake tears from her eyes. Dad kept his arm around Ethan's shoulder, as though protecting an innocent son. When they noticed me, none of them looked ashamed. They looked confident. They believed they had already won. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor stood first, describing how millions of dollars had disappeared from Carter Financial Holdings over the previous 2 years. According to the documents submitted by the company, I had overseen the accounts responsible for the missing money. Then came the witnesses. My father took the stand first. He looked directly at the jury. My younger son was always jealous of Ethan. He said, "We trusted him because he was family. We never imagined he would steal from his own brother." Every sentence was spoken with practiced emotion. Next came my mother. She cried as she described how difficult it had been to report her own child. "A mother never wants to believe something like this," she whispered. But the evidence left us no choice. Several jurors nodded sympathetically. Then Ethan walked to the witness stand. He lowered his head. "I trusted Liam with everything," he said quietly. "I considered him my best friend." The lie was almost impressive. We hadn't shared a meaningful conversation in nearly a decade. When the prosecutor finished, he smiled confidently. "The prosecution rests." The judge turned toward Victoria. "Defense." She stood without rushing. "Your Honor, before responding to these accusations, the defense requests permission to introduce several pieces of newly discovered evidence." Permission was granted. Victoria placed 3 sealed folders on the evidence table. The prosecutor frowned. "What exactly is this?" "The truth," she answered. The first folder contained forensic handwriting analysis. An independent expert had examined every signature on the financial documents. The conclusion was simple. They were forged, not copied by me. Copied from archived government paperwork that was never publicly available. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. The prosecutor's confidence faded. Victoria continued. "The second folder contains electronic login records from every financial transaction connected to this case. Large monitors displayed a timeline. Each transfer had been approved from one office computer. The location, Ethan Carter's executive office. Not mine, never mine." Ethan shifted nervously in his seat. Dad's face turned pale. Mom stopped crying. Victoria wasn't finished. The defense would also like to submit surveillance footage obtained from the company's security archives. The lights dimmed. Video filled the courtroom screens. There was Ethan, late at night, opening the company safe, removing confidential financial files. Hours later, another recording showed him meeting privately with an accountant who had already admitted to creating false records in exchange for payment. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The prosecutor stared at the screen in disbelief. My parents looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath them. Victoria closed the video. These recordings were stored on encrypted backup servers that neither the company nor the Carter family realized existed. Then she looked directly at my father. "You testified under oath that my client managed these financial accounts." "Yes," Dad answered weakly. Victoria clicked another button. Employment records appeared. "My client has never worked for Carter Financial Holdings." Silence. She displayed payroll records, no salary, no employee number, no office access, nothing. "So," Victoria continued calmly, "would you like to explain how someone who never worked for the company somehow controlled $8 million without possessing a company computer? Identification. Badge, payroll account, or office key?" Dad couldn't answer. Neither could Mom. Ethan stared at the table. Then Victoria turned toward me. "Mr. Carter." I stood. "Would you please tell the court where you have actually been for the past 8 years?" Every eye in the courtroom followed me. I took a slow breath. I left home because I realized I would never matter to my family. The room remained silent. While they believed I was struggling, I built a career elsewhere. I invested in businesses, created technology companies, and eventually acquired controlling interests in several corporations. The judge leaned forward. Victoria smiled, one corporation in particular. I nodded. 16 months ago, through a private investment group, I legally purchased the parent company that owns Carter Financial Holdings. A wave of shocked whispers swept across the courtroom. Ethan's eyes widened. Mom covered her mouth. Dad looked like he had stopped breathing. They had spent months trying to frame me for stealing from a company they thought belonged to someone else. They had never bothered to learn that I had quietly become its majority owner. Victoria placed one final document before the judge. The board authorized a confidential internal investigation over a year ago after irregular financial activity was detected. Every transfer made by Ethan Carter was documented before this case even began. The judge studied the evidence carefully. Then he looked directly at the prosecutor. It appears this court has been presented with overwhelming evidence of fraud, forgery, and possible perjury. For the first time since this nightmare began, my parents looked at me not with disappointment, but with fear. They finally understood the truth. The forgotten child they had tried to sacrifice was never powerless. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to let the truth speak for itself. The courtroom remained silent after the judge finished reviewing the final documents. The confidence my parents had carried into the hearing had completely disappeared. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in my father's eyes and genuine panic on my mother's face. They finally understood that their carefully constructed lies had collapsed. The judge looked toward the prosecutor. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds sufficient cause to dismiss all allegations against Mr. Liam Carter. A wave of relief washed over me, but I didn't celebrate. Justice wasn't about watching others suffer. It was about the truth finally being heard. The judge continued. The court also orders an immediate criminal investigation into the forged documents, financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and possible perjury committed during these proceedings. Before anyone could react, 2 investigators entered the courtroom. They walked directly toward Ethan. You are under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to fabricate evidence. Ethan's face turned ghostly white. He looked desperately at our parents. Dad, Mom, do something. For years they had always rescued him. Not this time. There was nothing left to hide behind. As officers placed handcuffs on his wrists, Ethan turned toward me. Liam, please tell them it was a misunderstanding. His voice shook with fear. I met his eyes. I begged this family for fairness my entire childhood. He lowered his head. You never listened. The officers escorted him from the courtroom, while reporters rushed outside to capture every moment. My parents remained frozen. Mom suddenly rushed toward me, tears streaming down her face. We made mistakes, she sobbed. You're still our son. I looked at her quietly. My name only mattered to you when you needed someone to blame. She reached for my hand. I stepped back. Dad cleared his throat. We can fix this. No. I answered softly. You had decades to fix it. Victoria placed a comforting hand on my shoulder while my parents stood speechless. There were no dramatic speeches left. No excuses, only consequences. Over the following months, the truth spread faster than the lies ever had. News outlets reported how forged evidence had nearly sent an innocent man to prison. The accountant who helped Ethan confessed as part of a plea agreement. Phone records proved my parents had coordinated false witness statements. Every secret unraveled. Ethan was convicted and sentenced to prison. My parents avoided prison because of their age and limited direct involvement in the financial theft, but they were convicted of conspiracy, filing false reports, and lying under oath. They received probation, heavy financial penalties, and hundreds of hours of community service. Their reputation, however, was beyond saving. Neighbors who once admired them crossed the street to avoid them. Former friends stopped answering their calls. Business partners quietly walked away. Everything they had spent years protecting disappeared within months. As for Carter Financial Holdings, the board officially removed every remaining member of my family from the company. As the majority owner, I appointed an entirely new leadership team based on honesty instead of family loyalty. For the first time, the company belonged to people who earned their positions. Several weeks later, I visited my grandmother's grave. I placed fresh white lilies beside her headstone. The wind moved gently through the trees. "I finally understand what you meant," I whispered. The truth always finds its way into the light. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Months became years. Instead of chasing revenge, I focused on building something meaningful. My company expanded internationally. We created scholarship programs for students from broken homes, funded legal aid for people who had been falsely accused, and opened a foundation that helped young entrepreneurs start businesses, regardless of their family background. Every success reminded me that kindness leaves a stronger legacy than bitterness. One afternoon, while attending the opening of a new community center, I met Emma, a volunteer who cared more about people than appearances. She never asked about the headlines or the fortune I'd built. She only wanted to know what inspired me to help others. 2 years later, she became my wife. Eventually, we welcomed a daughter into our lives. The first time I held her, I made a promise that echoed through my heart. "You will never have to earn my love. Because love is not a reward, it is a gift." Sometimes people ask whether I ever forgave my parents. The answer surprises them. I did forgive them, not because they deserved it, not because they apologized, but because carrying hatred would have chained me to the worst chapter of my life. Forgiveness gave me freedom. Trust, however, was something they had lost forever. I never spoke to them again. The greatest revenge was never sending them to prison or watching their lives fall apart. The greatest revenge was proving that the child they ignored became the person they could never break. They tried to write my ending with lies. Instead, I wrote a new beginning with truth, dignity, and love. And in the end, that victory belonged to me alone.